Hello everyone. So myself Shravan, like as Yannick kind of already introduced me, like I'm from the bio-robotics lab at EPFL. So I also work with Professor Auke Eisperth, and I'm also part of like the human brain project for specifically SP10, so where we are working on the neuro-robotics platform, and my focus is mostly on like exploring locomotion circuits for quadrupeds, like specifically mice at this point of my PhD. And today I'm going to present you like a more general overview of like what is happening and what was already done at BioRob in the past few years, and trying to draw parallels between how we use neuromechanical models and robotics to study and understand locomotion and spinal circuits. So it's been quite some time and a long journey for EPFL, for BioRob over the time, like in this specific area. Also, as Yannick touched upon, like there are some concepts that will overlap in the beginning, like especially for the swimming part, but there are like few other videos and interesting stuff that I'm going to show you. So at any point of time, like you can stop me and ask questions, because like I'm going to be switching between topics. I would have like a streamlined common thread that goes, but like still to just, if you want to stop me at any point, do not hesitate. And another disclaimer is that since I'm presenting work from a lot of people from my lab, like maybe I'm not like the expert at specific details you might ask for. So I will try to answer your questions to the best of my knowledge, and if not, like I'll be happy to put you in touch with like the people who are actually working on the specific problems. So let's start with like a small video just so that we all get into the same frame of mind. Like when you look at like animals running like this is an example of like a cheetah, like which can accelerate from like 0 to 60 miles per hour like in almost 3 seconds. So that's kind of like probably faster than most of the supercars that exist today. And all this is being done at like fairly remarkable synchrony between like the muscles, the brain, and like the physical interaction with the environment itself. So it's not an easy problem on any level of abstraction, like take like per se control, or like in terms of estimation, in terms of prediction and modeling. Each of these subcomponents itself pose like really big and open challenges, like as Yannick also mentioned in robotics. So it's really interesting and curious for us to see and learn what and how animals are actually doing this. And I'm going to present you like what we understand till now. I think I have. So what are the different components that actually make up like an animal in the most abstract level? So in our lab, like the way we look at things is like simply broken down into 4 essential parts. So the first one is like the musculoskeletal system. So what you see as like the muscles and the bones itself that really interacts with the environment. As like Yannick was stressing, like really on like the neural networks or like the brain itself is not the magic wand and the solution to every problem that we have. It's because like the musculoskeletal system is always like underrated or like often forgotten by neuroscientists, that it plays a more critical role than people think. Like it actually fills a big block of controls that like reduces the burden for like the brain or the spinal cord, or like the classical control methods that you would apply on for any specific task. I'm going to show you some examples on like how this has been approached and used in our lab also. Okay, this is. So the second component is the spinal cord itself, which is of like most interest and like more focused on. And like we break that down into 2 important components. One is the reflexes. So this is the part or the entity that connects your body with the environment. So here by reflexes, I mean like what is perceived. It could be like vision, touch, proprioception. But to keep it more constrained to the spinal cord, these reflexes mostly involve like proprioception and like contact and force feedbacks. And the second component is the central pattern generators. So just to briefly put, like these are neural circuits. There are no abstract like specific models, but circuits that are capable of producing rhythmic patterns that can be useful in many situations. Like again, Yannick mentioned, like breathing, heartbeats. There are a lot of things that are repeatedly going on and which do not need voluntary control, like even walking, for example, or running. Any task that can be repeated and learned over time could be translated to a central pattern generator like approach. And finally, we have the brain, which is like the most important thing for neuroscience. And neuroscience usually considers only brain as neuroscience, but we also think and like for sure believe that like spinal cord is part of that, and like neuroscience is broader than just the brain. So we don't look too much into the brain itself, but like we are more interested in like how the brain is interacting with the spinal cord to reduce the load for itself and also to produce more complex interactions. To put more into a block diagram scheme, like I show you here like the same block as before, but like without the animal. So you have like the descending modulation, which is from the brain that comes down. And then you have the spinal cord that acts as like the big station that takes most of the load for all this locomotion or like reaching tasks, and then converts the signals or like the higher level goals from the brain to much more lower level control signals, like you have hundreds of muscles that need to be coordinated for a given task. And finally, the musculoskeletal system interacting with the environment. And all of this information is fed back. So this forms the sensory reflexes and also the sensory feedback to the brain itself. So what is interesting for us is this translation. You see there are like a relatively lower dimension of inputs that the spinal cord receives, and then it maps that into this higher level of muscle space or like control space actions that really is interesting for like from a control perspective. Like, and these components can be broadly summed up into like reflexes and central pattern generators. So like as École would always like try to bring up this analogy, like it's kind of like a puppet where you have a lot of strings that kind of control your lower individual joints or more degrees of freedom. But on the higher level, you have like these simple controls that the brain or like the more intelligent system can take control of and just play with fewer parameters to produce actually a more complex scenario or more complex interactions. So to sum that up, like since we focus more on CPGs and spinal circuits, so what is it like really benefiting us for? So the first one is like the low bandwidth communication, which I showed you earlier. Like you mean you need like really less amount of information being transmitted from the brain to the final actuators in terms of bandwidth. Fast feedback loops, so everything need not go up until your brain to react. Like for example, we all have experiences where if you step on like on a stone, or like if you touch something hot, you immediately retract. So these kind of things need to be as fast as possible. And knowing the latencies that are involved in neural transmissions, like it is always better to be decentralized so that you can have quick reactions as fast as possible. Like we had the discussion just a few minutes ago, like to avoid obstacles or to navigate safely in unknown terrains or environments, it's often necessary to react and perceive things quickly so that you are in a better situation and you reduce your risk of failing. And the final one is like providing motor primitives for a large range of movements, which means that like over a period of time when you learn something, there's no necessity of like redoing the task with the same amount of energy or effort. So it's important that you transmit this information of learning into circuits where you no longer have to think about them. Like for example, riding a bicycle, like initially you need to think about balance, you need to think about so many things, but over time it becomes natural to you. So these are like circuits that are like slowly developed and like information passed to the spinal cord so you can react more quickly and involuntarily. So this is a schematic like of how we see things. So it's not really like a complete scientific established theory, but like this is how we see things over evolution. So these are the main set of animal species that we have studied and are studying. So the first one is lamprey, like École started with that, and then we moved to salamanders. So it's an interesting transition because from being underwater, you're slowly moving onto land, and evolutionarily, it's like a critical change for animals. And then we move to quadrupeds and then to humans. So all of these species are being, like we have been still studying, none of them have been like completed, but like there are like really interesting things going on. So here on the x-axis, you see the species, on the y, you see like how the control is probably shared. This is our intuition. So for all of the species, this body is important. There is a reason why every species is built the way it is for its environment. So it has like the same level of importance irrespective of what species you're looking at. What changes is like the reflexes and the central pattern generators. So as you see, we move higher in the species, there's more importance for the reflexes and lesser for the central pattern generators. One possible explanation for this is like the species that are more complex are exposed to environments that are also more complex, so which requires more level of sophistication and being able to be adaptive. And that also contributes to the descending modulation, which means that the brain is more active and like having more influence on how things are working. So one of the big questions that comes out of this look at plot over species is that like the sensory feedback versus the CPGs. So this is still a long debate that like people tend to fight over like day and night, but like, so the question is like, which is more important, like for locomotion? Like, is it the CPGs or the sensory feedback? Is it an absolute discrimination that you can do everything with CPG or everything with sensory feedback? Or do we need both? From a control perspective, it's quite clear that you need both. But like the animal sometimes tends to do things that make it look like it's completely ignoring the sensory feedback and it's just blindly doing a feed-forward approach. Or other times it's just depending on sensory feedback. So we look at how we see things. So here, like I show you the parallels that we have. Like as I said, we use neuromechanical simulations and robots to understand these species. So we have like kind of a translation for each of the species. Like for the lamprey, we have the amphibious robot, like Yannick was showing you a lot of examples of. Then we have salamandrica robot that tries to closely mimic the salamander, and we also have other robots that are not shown in this plot. Cheetah cub for the cats, and like common robot that's part of the IIT development, like for replicating human motions. And again, I show you a picture of how CPGs can be seen over different species. So here you have lamprey with like purely dominated by CPGs. This is from like very good scientific evidence from animal simulations and everything, because they have like dissections of different segments of the spinal cord, and like when they're electrically stimulated, they can still produce rhythmic activation patterns, which clearly show the existence of CPGs. And as we move higher, there's more descending modulation, more complex circuits, and more lesser influence of CPG circuits. So first, let's look at like the amphibious robots and like the swimming robots a bit more in detail and what we have done till now. Yeah. So this is kind of like the people who were like majorly responsible and like the funding agencies involved in development of these robots over the years. So just to give you a brief introduction like on what we are trying to study or what we are trying to look at, here is an example of salamander like swimming. So here you have like the anguilliform swimming. So it's the wavy S-type motion that Yannick was showing you in all his examples. So here you have like a nice traveling wave, which means like the head starts to move and then slowly transmits with a phase shift back to the tail to thrust itself to go forward. So this is one type of locomotion like which is mainly suited for like water. But since these animals are amphibious, they had to slowly transition to land, which meant that like they also had to use their limbs. So here you see an example where you have a standing wave, which means that like the shape of the body is fixed for a given period of time, and then the animal uses its limbs in this specific configuration to move forward. So there have been a lot of studies on like what kind of like configurations really help the animal to move forward if if the configuration of the body is not in phase with the legs, then it really makes it difficult for the animal to go ahead. See here, a small video example, probably you've already seen, but like it's the Salamandrica robot, like where you saw the transition now, like slowly it was first walking, and then it starts to swim. So this is teleoperated, so a human is actually operating like this transition. But what is interesting for us is like this is all done with the simple CPG circuits, which you have a CPG for swimming and you have a CPG for walking. So as I mentioned in the earlier slide, like how descending modulation can be of lower dimensions compared to this to the spinal cord, you can modulate speed, heading, and the change of gait just by a few switches. So you can say like, okay, let me just increase the drive on the spinal CPG, and then the rhythmic pattern and the coupling between the oscillators itself change the locomotion mode into swimming. And so all this is possible because you have like really lower set of dimensions to play with. And this is what we believe that the brain is doing, like so that it can actually have a lot of complex movements, but like with really simple commands so that it has time to think. So the next evolution was like plurobot, like so it was again like based on like animal physiology. So the idea was to take like X-ray images and then try to reduce and optimize into a form which can be translated to robots. So there is like a reduced degrees of freedom, but it was optimized in such a way that like it could still reproduce all the kinematics of the observed animal. We should have the video, yeah. So here is an example of like how closely we are able to mimic like the motion of the plurobot. So this is still amphibious. It can also swim, it can also walk, and it has like the same capabilities as like the Salamandrica robot you saw. And this is not like the latest version. The latest version is like even more capable of doing wider range of motions. So this method is not based on CPGs right now. Like what you see is more on inverse kinematics, where we are trying to program the robot to move in exactly the way that we observe in the real animals. But this is also possible to do with CPGs. And so until now, I was really telling you like all the benefits we have of using like CPGs and oscillator networks. But what happens like when Yannick was mentioning, when you put things in real life, it doesn't work. Why is that so? Because we are unable to perceive the robot itself and also its environment. So the missing part is like the sensory feedback. So which kind of like puts the pieces together. But for that to happen, you need the musculoskeletal system. So this whole loop is what like makes the system more integrated and helps to perform better in real life scenarios to cope with things that you see that, are done by animals in day-to-day life. So to that aim, like this is still a work in progress, like the HFSP project, like the goal is to understand how CPGs and sensory feedbacks can work together in amphibious animals. Here, like a quick look at like history, like so this was like one of the first works of École like during his PhD. So this is an example of like how a lamprey would like react to when you have a perturbation. So this blue field you see is like the water or the currents that's trying to push the eel away. So as soon as it hits this boundary, it's still trying to do the same movements as if it was in the still water. So it no longer can actually cope with this. But like the moment you introduce like sensory feedback, it has a perception of like what is happening to itself because of the environment, and it's able to like go through this field of perturbations. So the goal of the project was to really see like then how exactly does sensory feedback contribute to this rhythm generation and rhythm coordination, and what are the limits and boundaries of how exactly this feed forward and feedback components play well together. So this was like the work of Robin, who recently graduated from BioRob. So what he was looking at was like to see if you can actually produce locomotion or swimming just with sensory feedback. So what he did was like initially we had like this chain of oscillators that were strongly coupled, which meant that the head knew what the tail was doing, or like the tail was influenced by the head because of the couplings between them. And you can see that coupling over here. Like, so you have like the phase of the subsequent oscillators being linked together, so that when something happens to the first oscillator, it definitely influences the ones that are before and after. But what he did was like to remove this coupling and add this local feedback. So this local feedback is what the animal or the robot senses as pressure or forces from the surrounding water. So skipping the details, here you can see like these connections are now cut, and like the only way these oscillators can actually talk to each other is because of the interactions between the environment. So the environment is actually now causing the coupling between the oscillators. As you can see initially in the video, like the eel or like the robot like starts, or the simulation starts with like a arbitrary oscillation, and the oscillators are completely out of phase. And due to the interaction with the water or like the hydrodynamic forces, it slowly starts to couple. So here you see the example again. Like over time, these are like the phases, and then they start become synchronous so that it forms like nice anguilliform swimming. I'm not going to go more into details, but I can show you. Yeah, this is just to reiterate what I just said. So here, like it's an example still in simulation, but like to show how this method does not affect or it's not influenced by body lengths. So you can have like different body lengths, and you can still have a strong coupling just with sensory feedback. So this really shows that it's actually influencing the coupling between the oscillators irrespective of the length of the body. It's not something specific to one example or one set of species. So then the next attempt was to actually try and see it if really works in robots. So this was like the first attempt, like to do it with the NV robot that we have. So this robot is not actually built for this purpose, but we still try to use this to test this application. We're also building a new one that's really much longer and like specifically built for testing the hypothesis that we observe in simulations. But we already have like the first results from NV robot that the sensory feedback alone can actually couple the individual oscillators and produce oscillations. Yeah, right now it doesn't have any turning or any control, so it just goes forward. So just to summarize like what we saw for amphibious robots and simulations, so local sensory feedback can actually have a lot of positive things, and up until now, like people strongly believe that in the lower species, like the chart I showed you, even ourselves, like that CPGs were more prominent, but actually having sensory feedback gives you a lot more benefits. You can even produce locomotion even without like strong coupling between the oscillators. So it's kind of like a tightly integrated system. So it can help deal with perturbations, increase faster swimming, and you have like nice synchronization between the oscillators, and also it corrects gait patterns for the CPGs. So you have like a bunch of advantages by using strong sensory feedback. So what we still have to do is to explore like different sensory modalities, which means that like right now this was just pressure feedback, just touch or like just force from the hydrodynamics. So there are more sensory feedbacks that are in the animal, like the stretch or like the velocities or like its proprioception from the muscles. Also to implement this as a neural network, so this has already been started, and like we have like good first results like on using these models extrapolated to neural networks. So next, like the next immediate transition that we can, of course, think of is like to move to quadrupeds, which are more land-based and built for locomotion and on land. So the biggest difference between like this amphibious robots and the land-based robots are like the posture or the musculoskeletal system itself. So for the amphibious robots, it's mostly a sprawling posture, which means that like they sit low on the ground, their mass is like very close to the ground, and their legs are like spread apart. So which makes it quite convenient for them to just move their body like they did in water and just use the feet to move forward. This has like a lot of benefits in terms of balance, stability issues. As you can see here, you have like a support polygon, which means that as long as your center of mass is inside this polygon, you're bound to be stable. So your animal has like a bigger region to move around like its limbs and still be stable in most situations. The problem with upright posture or mammalians or quadrupeds is that like they have a lower or a smaller area of support polygon, which means that like the center of mass now should be constrained inside the smaller area to be stable, which you might think like why would they even come up with this type of evolutionary approach. The advantage of being critically stable is that it allows you to be agile. So when you're critically stable, you can do things faster, you can do things, you can change your momentum much easier, but at a cost of like being losing control or being more prone to instabilities. So as I said, like the musculoskeletal system is often neglected, and like more importance is given that like, okay, the brain can do anything. You give a piece of a wooden box, it can still make it run or walk, but it's not the case usually. We have like quite a high dependency on how the body is structured, and that influences how and what we can do. So this example is from the cheetah cub. So here, like the approach was to use structures that are inspired from biology. So here, like the leg structure, so you have like a spring-loaded pantograph approach, which means that these are not actuated, but these are just passively placed. And there's only one actuator at the hip, and the rest is passive. So what this allows is like a really simple actuation control problem. As Yannick was saying, like when you have a eel with like 7 or 20 degrees of freedom, it becomes a mess to mathematically track what's happening. But when you have a simple 1 degree of freedom for each leg, and the rest is compensated by the mechanical system itself, it offers a lot of advantages. Like here, how like my colleague is showing, like you can press it, you can throw it, you can have like a lot of impressive passive behaviors. So here, an example of like the cheetah cub walking. So here, it's completely in open loop, which means it has no sensors, no sense of where it is or what it is doing. It's just running purely. Okay, it should repeat again, yeah. So what you can observe here is that like it has no sense that there is a step that it is going to experience at any given point of time. But the reason why it is able to still cope with this perturbation is because of its compliance in the legs. Because of the spring-loaded actuators, you can actually dampen, or you have like an under-actuated system that can actually take the energy that it missed to impose stability back into the system. So, and the next question is like how we have done with like eel or salamanders. Like once we have like studied the feed forward part, like the CPG part, like we're also interested in like how the sensory feedback plays, right? Like that's kind of like the big question that we are looking at. So in partnership with like Human Brain Project, like we are working on the construction of like neuromechanical model. So there are more people involved than what I show here, but like this is to show that what we are exactly doing from our lab side. So currently what we have is like a hind limb model of the mouse, so which has like a reduced degrees of freedom, just enough for us to have hind limb locomotion experiments. So you have like 4 degrees of freedom, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then you have like a pair of muscles for each degree of freedom. Like someone was asking earlier, like, why don't we use muscles to actually build these robots? So one approach is to actually build robotic muscles, but the other approach is to actually simulate or model muscle-like behavior in motors itself. So this gives you all the advantages, but at the same time, you don't have a bulky system that we would expect right now by having these muscles into the robotic systems. So the first approach was to recreate like the Eckerberg and Pearson's study like on cats, like to use reflex models purely to simulate locomotion in quadrupeds. So here is an example where it's more like a state machine where you have a transition between one phase of your locomotion to the other phase. So in typical walking, like you would have like the swing where you would just swing your leg in air and then you touch down, and then you have a stance phase, which means that your foot is on the ground and then you're trying to propel your body forward. This is the phase which you actually provide the thrust, and then you lift off and then you repeat the sequence. So by having specific rules, specific reflex laws, you can actually transition from one to another to produce stable locomotion. So here I show you like some of the preliminary results that we have like for the mouse locomotion. So you have like some reduced degrees of hind limb muscles. The forelimbs are fixed, so for now it's a very much easier control problem because it doesn't fall yet. But the challenge is to like actually come up with the laws that would propel it forward. We also have examples like where you're going downhill and it is still stable with the same reflexes. So the reflexes really allow you to adapt to the environment and come up with like a control set of control inputs that would make it stable. Yeah, and the same example when it goes up. So you can see that the legs are slowing down when it's not possible to reach, but it's still, the other leg is still waiting for one of the legs to touch down so that it doesn't fall. So these are like rules that are imposed by the reflexes and learned over time. So to further extend this, like the next intuitive step was to merge like this open loop stuff, CPGs, with like the feedback. So this is in collaboration with Simon Denner and Ilya Rybak's team in the US. So they are like kind of the pioneers of mouse CPG networks or rodent CPG networks. So what we have here is like something more biological, identified set of populations of neurons in the spinal cord, and then simulation models on top of it that try to closely replicate as much as possible. So here we have this CPG here, like the rhythm generation. So you have a mutual inhibition between flexion extension centers through interneurons. And then you have an intermediate layer called the pattern formation, so which really adds value to the CPG, because most of the community thinks like CPGs means like rhythmic sinusoidal waves. But the challenge is to produce more complex rhythmic activity. And that's the role of pattern formation layer. And then finally, you have the motor neurons, and then the feedback that goes up to both of these layers to modulate the neural activity. So I have another video. Here you don't see the muscles, but like they're simulated in the background, but like the muscles are not shown here. But again, we could produce like stable gaits by optimizing like the network parameters to work with feedback. So this is working with feedback and the CPGs together. So now we move to humans. Like when I say we move to humans, like the lab is parallelly working on all of these, and different people are working on different problems with different approaches. And what I'm also showing you here is like quite a limited set of examples. There are like more, there are people working with more control perspectives, more bio-inspired, completely bio. So there is like a big, wide range of varieties in which we approach problems. Yep. So the big question when it comes to humans is like, what are the roles of these relative components For lampreys, it's quite well established that the CPGs play a super strong role, even though now we are slowly starting to discover like the reflexes are also more important and can contribute to way more than what we initially thought. But for humans, it's even more trickier because we cannot do experiments like they did with lampreys, where they segmented the spinal cord and let it run. So with the humans, it becomes more trickier, and that is where I guess like simulation models and robots can really be powerful tools to identify solutions or explanations. So one of the first attempts, like what my colleague like Florin worked on, was like to use a reflex model that was initially proposed by Hartmut Geyer, which actually could produce kinematics and muscle activations and dynamics, like ground reaction forces, that was very close to what we observe in humans. So this reflex model was very powerful. But the problem with the reflex model was that it was well tuned for a specific gait. It was very hard to change gait speeds or direction. Like you saw in the initial example of Salamandrica robot, with just a joystick, you could change from swimming to walking, changing direction, speed. This was all possible because you had like lower set of input parameters. But here, it is not so, you have to re-optimize your whole reflex network. To see how we can improve this, like Florin worked on integrating central pattern generator networks with reflexes and descending modulation. So what was impressive, and like one of the interesting outcomes of the study, was like there's a gradient in control, which means that like the circuits that are closer to your spine or hip like are more driven by CPGs, whereas the distal circuits are more driven by sensory feedbacks. So which means that like as you go away from the spine, you're more depending on sensors than CPGs to move in any given environment. So here is the example of like the stable gait. This is still constrained in 2D plane, so the human can only fall front or back, not sideways. But here you can still see how he's able to change speed, he's able to change the frequency, step cycles, all by changing just a few parameters like a keyboard, like a game on a keyboard. So the interesting outcome was that like since we were so close to mimicking the human behavior, why not use it on the humans, like where we can actually help? Like, so that's kind of like the link to neuroprosthetics. So where we have a system that's closely has similar components as the humans itself. So in situations where you have like partial or complete spinal cord injuries, you have a disruption in the communication between the brain and the spinal cord. So if we can replace these components that are no longer receiving descending modulation, you could actually make a contribution to help like people gain their locomotion back. So this is a Symmetron project, like in collaboration with like University of Twente and Imperial College and like Santa Lucia. So what we do here is like to use the networks or like the approaches developed for to study humans to apply on exoskeletons. So here, what the controller does is to supply torques to each of these joints, and what it receives back is the joint angles and ground states. So nothing else is imposed here. You're not telling it to go at a specific trajectory. You're not asking it to do a specific task. It's mostly being adaptive and being more in a reflexive mode, but also using CPGs to keep these reflexes going. So here we have like an example of the same, like where a person with complete spinal cord injury, which means that they no longer have any control of their lower body segments, is able to walk again, and more like in a human like gait pattern at varying speeds. As you can see here, like you can go from like 0.6 like to 1.2 meters per second, and all he needs to do is like to just keep his upper body stable, because right now like the exoskeleton does not have enough degrees of freedom to provide this support, but apart from that, it's able to do most of the cyclic behaviors. So in this plot, it's probably the only plot in the presentation. So what I would like to show you is like how closely does the kinematics match the human kinematics. So here we have like the dotted line for the healthy subjects, and the other blue colors at different speeds for the spinal cord injury patients. So there's like really a close, almost one-to-one match of the kinematics. And the impressive part is that these kinematics are not imposed, but these are the outcome of the reflex laws or the controllers that you observed from the humans and then you developed. So here in this example, like there's also push perturbations. So where like the person really holds the leg for a small amount of time, and then what you can observe is like you see there's a smaller step taken whenever there's a perturbation. So this is naturally what a human would do as well. Like when you're walking, then you would like try to compensate for the perturbation and then go back into this normal state of locomotion. So all of these are not imposed. None of these are like pre-programmed. So which means that this is kind of like the approach what should be for like real world environments where you cannot really anticipate or estimate every single situation that you can encounter, but you should be able to react and respond. So one last example of exoskeletons again. So this is like completely without any support. So he just has the crutches and then he's able to walk, and all this is possible like with the virtual spinal cord model that acts upon it. So the motors right now, like in the model, think that there are muscles, that they're actually acting on muscles. So you get feedbacks from the muscles, like not from the human, but like the mapping between the joint angles and like the length of the muscle. So it's kind of like a virtual template of the lower body itself imposed onto the exoskeleton. So I'm almost at the end. Yeah. So to just summarize like what we saw, neuromechanical models and robots are powerful tools. So we saw like a lot of examples right now, like how we can use them to understand and like test and validate different hypotheses. So the long battle between like CPGs and sensory feedback, more and more results and evidences show that like they're good friends, which means that they should work together rather than as exclusive components. Probably their roles have changed, like evolutionarily their dominance may be more where you have environments that just needs to do one kind of action, like swimming. So you don't need like different modalities of swimming in the environment, but you need to have different gaits on land. So this point is from like the work of Robin. Like we have distributed oscillators that are synchronized by sensory feedback. So you could have a system where it's not localized or centralized, but you have a chain. But then all these are still coupled with the environment and the sensory feedbacks. But of course, there's always more to be done and more things to be explored. So if you want to like, if you want to know more, like you can visit us at like biorob.epfl.ch. And these are just like the current people that are part of BioRob and the alumni who worked on all of these projects. So I hope I gave you a good summary of what's going on. So this is an example of common robot in simulation. So this is how like we try to play and test things out to make things ready for real life approaches. So here, as you can see, this is with CPG and reflexes, and it's quite stable to perturbations. Like, I mean, it doesn't have a head, and it's still able to move, so which we are clearly making a statement to neuroscientists that we don't need the brain always, we can work without it. And it has only perception of itself and nothing else. But there could be situations where, like, you know, you could knock it over, so there's always scope to improvement and learning more. Sorry? Yeah, now all we need is some water. Yeah. Yeah, so if you want more information, you could check it out at BioRob website. So that's the end of my talk. Thank you for listening.